Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you two very notable upsets played at the Chess Olympiad just yesterday in round 3. The first game was played between Lodici and Anish Giri, and the second one between Stremavicius and Vincent Keymer, so Lithuania versus Germany and Italy versus the Netherlands. Of course, Anish Giri and Vincent Keymer are super grandmasters over 2700. And it's always interesting to see how they lose. You don't often get a chance to see that because they normally don't play normal grandmasters. So the first game, Lodici is a strong Italian grandmaster. If you would like to see him play against me, here's the link to the game. I played him in the Graz Open last year in January. So in this game, Lodici starts with d4. This is of course a board 1 game in their match because they are both the strongest players for their countries. Knight f6 by Anish Giri, c4 e6, knight c3, allowing the Nimzo-Indian, and bishop to b4. And they play a very interesting line after e3, which is, you could argue, the most popular move. b6 was played, which is the St. Petersburg variation, and this is a mix between the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian structure, and it could become very interesting depending on how black plays this. So bishop d3, bishop b7, all very standard, and knight e2, sacrificing the g2 pawn. This is a well-known line, although it's way more popular to play the move knight f3. So it was interesting to me to see that Lodici went for this arguably suboptimal line, probably in order to get an imbalanced position. Of course, knight e2 isn't losing, but black is certainly equal, maybe slightly better. So knight e2, of course, Giri takes the pawn, rook g1. That's the idea. You're going to have a quick kingside attack. However, the problem is that black's king has not castled yet, so it's never clear to me when these ideas work if the king still hasn't committed. Bishop f3. Now you don't take on g7 here. If you take on g7, you are basically losing after knight h5, and once the rook drops back, then we could play bishop c3 because this knight is pinned, bc3, and then follow that up with queen h4, and you don't have a sensible way to defend the h2 pawn. You have to unpin, you have to, well, basically you're losing. So the idea isn't to regain the pawn on g7. He plays rook g3, forcing the bishops to make a decision. So bishop takes c3, bc3, this has all been played before, and this is the best way to play, and bishop e4. You don't want to take the knight on e2, you don't want to leave the d3 bishop on the board. Queen c2 played, bishop takes, queen takes, and knight h5. This is all still fine. Both players are playing correctly. There are no more games from this position, so it's sort of new territory, but I'm sure at some point this was their prep, maybe for Lodici even the day before, or the morning before the game, so yesterday morning. And rook h3. Fine. g6 defends the knight. And what can we say about this position? Well, black has all the pawns on the board. The structure seems extremely solid. However, black has played g6 and b6, and there is a clear absence of bishops in this position. However, white's pieces aren't that great either. With the exception of, let's say, the option to go bishop a3 and to attack the f8 square, which can easily be parried with either d6 or knight c6, knight e7, I don't really see a clear way to improve. So we are going to have to do something about the structure. If the structure doesn't allow you to improve your pieces, you have to change the structure. So e4. Gaining space, maybe preventing e5, sort of embarrassing this knight, opening up the bishop, and setting up against kingside castles, for example. There could be ideas of taking the knight, playing e5, and then getting this knight into e4 and f6. So that would be very close to suicide, in my opinion. For example, if castles, e5, let's say black makes a random move, takes, pawn takes, knight g3. Very, very scary. If the knight reaches f6, you resign. So after e4, Anish Giri played d6, playing against e5 and also giving himself the option to at some point play knight d7, which is sensible. The knight on c6 really has no future. Okay, knight g3. Lodici wasn't interested in taking the knight while the king is still on e8. That's understandable. Okay, knight takes g3, queen takes g3. Now castling kingside is not an option at all. I mean, you don't want to castle kingside here because bishop g5 is coming, e5 is coming, bishop h6 is coming, even rook h7 could be an option. It seems scary. So f6, fighting against e5. Okay, bishop h6, preventing castles in all variations. And at this point, Anish Giri makes his first mistake. Up to this point, black is perfectly fine, even slightly better, and everything's good. Here he plays rook g8. Now rook g8 is a mistake. You want to develop and cover g7 and keep defending h7. Basically, undefending h7 is a tactical problem that's going to become apparent later. So in positions like these, you should aim to include more of your pieces into the defense. And if you can defend against the threat by including a new piece and not, well, undefending something, then you should do that. So from a human perspective, queen e7 makes way more sense than rook g8. And the engine says queen e7 is equal, rook g8 is a big advantage to white, almost +1. So after rook g8, Lodici plays e5. And this is an astonishing move. I mean, I'm not sure I would have played it, but it makes a ton of sense because you're getting rid of one of the pawns if black takes. So for example, if d takes, this rook is coming to d1 and it's going to be very, very strong. And if we can then imagine both pawns disappearing, the rook on d1, the bishop on g5, there's a way to get to d8. There's also rook h7. So it's starting to get really scary. If f takes, then we simply play queen g2. We're attacking this rook, and once that's defended, let's say c6, now we go bishop g5. And let's say the queen moves away, we take on e5, the rook is coming to d1, so black has to play d5, cd5, something takes, let's say queen d5. This seems very, very good for white. If even after the queen trade, we can take, c takes, rook takes h7, and all of black's pieces are on the back rank, the rooks are disconnected. And the same goes for d5, it's even worse. So Giri cannot take. This is, at least for me, this was a very instructive point in the game. e5, using the fact that you have better major pieces and a safer king, and that black isn't developed. So knight d7. And now, Lodici increases the pressure with a very, very sensible move. There's tension in the center, and weaker players often tend to resolve the tension because they feel pressured when there's stuff going on. Strong players keep that as it is and bring more pieces into play. So castles queenside. Now taking d5 is just a blunder, and you cannot do that because you're going to lose material. The knight's going to be pinned. Queen e7 finally, the best move. It should have been played way earlier, avoiding a lot of complication. And now he starts opening up lines. E takes f6. Of course, you don't want to take with the queen because that at least gives white tempo with bishop g5, and then maybe rook h7 is hanging. So knight takes, defending h7. But now bishop g5 pins the knight. And here you already have to be very, very careful. So what has drawn me to this game and made me, well, analyze it and show it to you is the simplicity with which Lodici converted this position. In this position, Giri made a move that loses the game straight away. Not that he isn't much worse, but after his next move, it's a simple win for white. So pause the video and try to defend for black. What would you do? So he should have gone rook f8, defending the knight. And after queen h4 increasing the pressure, let's say h6, you can take on h6. This draws the queen away from the knight, at least for one move, and black has enough time to castle. And after something like rook f3, you can play rook f7, preparing to double up rooks. You're going to lose a pawn, and you'll end up a pawn down, actually, but so what? I mean, you're saving the game. Something like bishop f6 now, rook f6 should be about 0.8, not a disaster. He played knight e4. This is a disaster. Why? Because we trade queens into a completely losing rook endgame. Why? Because h7 is hanging. If this rook was on h8, knight e4 would be a good move. So Lodici takes on e7, knight takes g3, f takes g3, of course, opening up the f file, preparing to bring the rook to f7. And, well, Giri has to recapture the bishop, or you're a piece down. So king e7, and after rook takes h7, this is over. It's over. It's over. There is nothing you can do. So let's look at the material. It's 6 pawns each, for now. But how do you prevent me from playing rook f1, rook f7? Once I bring my rooks to the 7th rank, how do you plan to defend c7, e6, and g6? At the same time, white only has one weakness, and that's h2. So king d8, the only move. Rook f1, you cannot go rook f8. You cannot connect your rooks, you have to play king c8, trying to defend. But now rook f7, and that's it, bye-bye. I'm gonna take on c7 with check. Moving the pawn forward doesn't help at all, because I can pick up any of these pawns. King b7 connecting the rooks. Rook takes c7, king a6. He played rook h e7. There are many, many moves. You can go rook d7, e7, whatever. Rook gf8, trying to do this and take the pawn on h2, but it's a bit too late. King b2, avoiding a check and avoiding his king being tied down on the first rank. d5, rook takes e6, d takes c4, rook takes c4. He played rook f2 check, and after king b3, he resigned. Why? Well, you are a bunch of pawns down. If you take on h2, I take on g6, and white has 2 passed pawns, 2 extra passed pawns, and this is an easy win. What's even worse is that the rooks can just go back to the 7th rank and keep tying down the rook, otherwise rook takes a7 check happens. And in conjunction with a4, that's going to be mate. So not only is white winning in the endgame, white is also technically a rook up, or more material is lost. And for me, this was exactly the type of position, the type of game I would one day like to be able to play against stronger players. A clean game, a game which resembles Karpov and Fischer games. They just win. They don't do anything spectacular. It's just a winning position. They just play normal moves and win. Now let's go to the second game. This is the key position in the second game, and this is on move 3. So after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, inviting the Nimzo, if knight c3, Stremavicius played knight f3. And there are many, many normal moves here. You can play b6, a queen's Indian. You can play d5, a queen's gambit. You can play bishop b4, the Bogo. You can play c5, going into the Benoni. You can play a weird 2 knights or the Chigorin with knight c6. Many normal moves. But Keymer plays h6. And this is a move I have never seen before. So usually after knight f6, e6, when I have white, I play knight c3, and in my game against Lodici Lorenzo, you can actually see that position with it, play an Nimzo-Indian. I have never seen h6. Now, I have played knight f3 a couple of times, so it's good that I know this now. I cannot begin to explain the idea because I don't fully understand it. It's my opinion that this prevents lines with bishop g5. That's my opinion. It also makes lines with bishop f4 harder to play because there's g5 and g4, chasing away the knight and undefending d4. But that's my opinion. It's also highly likely that this is designed to confuse lower rated players. And in Keymer's case, a 2500 player is a full league below him. It's maybe unfair to say that about the Grandmaster, but 2700 and 2500 isn't the same league, which is why I'm showing you this game. However, Stremavicius plays what's technically the second most popular move against this. He goes for a Catalan setup and just uses h6 as a wasted tempo. In the Catalan, Black's eventually going to have to go d5, and why did you play h6? It makes no sense. If we're going to play the Catalan, you don't want the pawn on h6 because normally the bishop doesn't come out to g5. So now Keymer plays bishop b4, a sort of Bogo or Catalan hybrid with the quick bishop b4. Bishop d2 played. I think he also could have gone knight bd2, but this is fine. Bishop e7. We just have a normal position in which, for some reason, Black has wasted the tempo with h6. So technically, White is up a tempo or up a move compared to normal main lines. Bishop g2, d5, queen c2. Let's look at the development. White has two developing moves left. Move the knight, probably to c3, and castle. Black has to move the bad c8 bishop. Black has to at some point play c6 if they wish to play the closed Catalan. Taking on c4 makes very little sense with the queen on c2. Black has to develop the knight to d7. Then those knights have to find good squares. And then Black also has to castle. So White has a tremendous lead in development. A huge lead in development. So castles, castles. And c6. So we have a close Catalan position with the pawn on h6. White isn't better. It should be equal according to the engine. So that's probably what makes this line interesting for super grandmasters. White is up 0.3. So playing h6 really hasn't hindered Black's game that much. And obviously an engine would be able to play this perfectly. However, for humans, I would be reluctant to go into this. Rook d1, knight bd7, bishop f4. Okay, a5. Makes sense. You want to stop an expansion and maybe play b6 followed by bishop b7, or at least fight against c5 with b6. Knight c3. Now it's getting kind of scary, in my opinion. If you take on d5, if the bishop commits to b7 and you take on d5 and e takes, that's fine. But if c takes, then there's knight b5, and with this bishop here, you could have problems on the dark squares. So a5 is a very committal move. b6, sort of fighting against c5. Knight e5. Okay, we're on the c6 pawn. Either bishop b7 or you have to take. Queen c7 loses to knight g6 at least. So knight e5. And interestingly, he takes d e5. And this is in the spirit of the opening. You may have a suboptimal bishop on f4, but this knight lacks squares, the knight on f6. So the knight goes to d7, and now c d5. All of this has been played before. These are all the best moves, and both players are playing perfectly. C takes d5, e4. You're breaking the center. Okay, so Black can hardly allow the d pawn to fall. Not only does that open up the center in a very favorable way for White because the queen is lined up with the rook, but it also makes White's e5 pawn mobile. And if we do nothing and let's say this happens, then this blunders a pawn and e6 is coming at some point. This is a disaster with the two bishops perfectly lined up. So on e4, d4 has to be played. And rook takes d4. So what has happened now is that White is technically up a pawn. White has 7 pawns, Black has 6 pawns. And they may not be the best looking pair of pawns on e4 and e5, but having doubled pawns in the center can be extremely advantageous simply because they control a lot of squares. Notice how this knight is restricted. Notice how they prevent White's e-pawn from moving, activating the bishop. Notice how the pawn on e4 blocks an eventual bishop b7. If the bishop comes out to a6, it's really staring at thin air. So, you know. The downside is, though, black can make things very interesting with g5, undefending the pawn on e5 and preparing to win the pawn back. Now bishop e3. And if the pawn is taken immediately, then you lose the queen, so you cannot do that. But eventually, since this pawn has been undefended, it may be taken. Another thing is, you played bishop e3, there's a rook on d4. What if black plays bishop c5? That's what Keymer ended up playing, attacking the rook. And when I was analyzing this position, I did it without the engine, and I was struggling to understand white's next move. White played queen e2. Why would you give up the exchange? Why? This is the line I had looked at. So if bishop takes d4, then bishop takes d4. And I don't know what black does here. I couldn't figure out what black should do. But I knew what white should do. White should play queen h5. And white is on the h6 pawn. More importantly, this rook could come to f1 or to d1. This pawn could move out to h4. This pawn could move out to f4. And there could be a very, very quick attack. Let's say bishop b7, queen h5. Let's say you defend the pawn, and now h4. Now how do you defend? f6 maybe? hg5, fg5? What if knight b5, knight d6? It seems very scary. It seems that the fact that white is down the exchange is completely meaningless. So on bishop c5, Stremavicius did not move the rook, which is absolutely correct. He played queen e2. And Keymer did not take the rook, which is absolutely correct. One line, instead of queen e2 trying to save the rook, is, let's say, rook d2. Then bishop e3, f e3, and queen e7. And tripled pawns are not fun. Even if, let's say, rook a1, I couldn't see why white would be better here. Let's say rook d6, we take on e5. Your bishop is kind of bad. e4 is going to be a target. f5 may come at some point. Okay, white still has the b5 square, but it's nothing major. In any case, on bishop c5, queen e2, and then queen e8, the rook was not taken. And now the rook saves itself because you're able to take on e3 with the queen, avoiding tripled pawns. And also, if knight e5 is played as a follow-up, you cannot really play queen takes b6 because knight c4 forks the queen and rook. Sorry, if the queen was on e3. So you'd have problems here. So it's still complicated. However, black decided not to take on e3. I think taking on e3 is, I don't know, it's okay. White's rooks are too active. White should be better. Of course, white doesn't take on b6. So bishop a6 was played instead, which is better. And this position is, excuse me, perfectly equal. Queen d1 played, and taking on e3 now is very, very problematic. So I think black should have taken. I couldn't understand why. If bishop takes e3, then f e3 is just very, very bad. Black should be winning after knight e5. There's just no compensation for the weak pawns, the c4 square, the e3 pawn. Black is going to be able to challenge the file. However, after bishop e3, white doesn't recapture on e3, white takes on d7, and now you're keeping the pawn. And when you save this bishop, I go bishop f1, this should be equal. The fact that I'm up a pawn doesn't really matter that much. However, on queen d1, black did not take. Black took on e5. And now, I think white's position is great, because we can take on c5. And from here on, I think white was in charge of this game. And once again, we come to a point where the conversion seems easy. This is the most interesting part of the game for me, because I often get positions in which I'm better, even against much stronger players. And then when we reach a point like this, not that I don't convert flawlessly and easily, I don't convert at all. Okay, so bishop takes c5, bc5, f4, chasing the knight away. Knight c4, rook f2. This pawn is moving forward. Knight e3, doesn't matter, queen f3. Knight takes bishop, f takes g5. Why? Opening up lines. Well, the knight doesn't have any squares, so we can insert this move, ruining black's pawn structure completely. H takes g5. And now again, not recapturing the knight, but e5. Look at the attack that's coming. This knight is coming to e4 and then to f6. This pawn is loose. The queen is coming to h5. Very scary. If you turn on the engine here, it says 0.5, nothing major, but it seemed to me when I was analyzing this that black was already losing. I just thought that nobody could survive this with black. Rook b8, knight e4, still not recapturing on g2. There's no need to do that. f5. Okay, guarding the f6 square, trying to guard the f6 square, but of course, white just takes this. So takes. If well, this is an interesting move. If you play knight f6 check here, then of course it's on the queen, so we have to take. However, after ef6, there's queen b7, and you are gonna either save the knight or keep the exchange. So if queen e2, for example, then we play rook d8, and these pawns are marching forward. An exchange doesn't really matter much when I have this amazing bishop here, and I'm gonna grab the exchange back. So on f5, not knight f6, but ef6. Now I have a passed pawn on f6. Bishop b7, rook takes g2, queen g6. Okay, rook e2, defending the knight. The knight was attacked twice. And I don't understand Keymer's decision here. Keymer had the option to liquidate into a drawn endgame, basically. Maybe he's slightly worse, but it should be a draw. So he should take on e4, white takes on e4 with something, let's say rook e4, and then queen takes f6. We're on b2, we're on the queen, so let's say takes, takes. I doubt that a 2700 player would lose this. I would lose this maybe with black because I have 4 weaknesses and black has 0. But even if I drop 1 pawn, I should still be able to hold. This is very, very close to equal, if not all zeros according to the engine. Instead of that, he did not trade straight away. Now what's the problem? He played c4, and that's a clear waste of tempo. Why? Because now I play rook f1. This blocks the bishop from coming to a6. It allows me to defend the f6 pawn. So now once you take on e4, I'm just recapturing and I'm still up this amazing pawn on f6. Not to mention that I may be able to go f7 at an opportune moment, trading everything and then playing knight g5 check. So now he trades. And now rook e4, of course not queen e4. You want your queen on the board. Rook b2, but that doesn't matter. I'm just breaking through. Rook takes e6. And good luck defending this. It's losing, there's no way to defend. The best move may have been king h8, but it's still busted. In the game he played queen h7, avoiding f7 check from attacking the queen, so queen h7, but still f7 check. King h8, the only move. If you play queen takes f7, then you're losing. Rook takes g6, and you're obviously going to be losing material. You have to take on g6 or you lose your queen. So on f7, king h8, and queen c3 was the final move of the game. Oh, queen g7, of course, runs into rook h6. Checkmate. So, yeah. And on rook e6, if you play the best engine move, king h8 instead of queen h7, then still queen a3 double attacks 2 rooks. You have to save them. Let's say rook b8, f7 attacks the rook, attacks the queen. Oh, sorry, attacks the queen and threatens to promote. So let's say queen e6 check. We just make a queen. Rook takes f8, queen takes f8, and this is mate in what, 4? King h7, rook f7, king g6, queen g8, king h5, rook h7, king g4, and you can at least take the queen. I mean, there's probably a mate somewhere, but you can at least take the queen. So that's how Keymer and Giri lost their games yesterday. I mean, I was really, really surprised to see these games, and I was well, happy to analyze them. I hope you like them. I think I'm going to be covering some more upsets from the Olympiad in the future. I should mention that Croatia faced Uzbekistan after having won the first 2 rounds with a perfect score. Maybe we had 1 draw. We had 1 draw out of 8 games. And then, you know, Abdusatorov on board 1 and so on. We managed to get a draw on board 2. Sasha Martinovic drew. The other Nodirbek, I always forget his last name. Leon unfortunately lost on board 3 and Zdenko Kozul lost on board 4. So cross your fingers that Croatia does better in the following rounds. I mean, the Uzbek team is extremely strong, so that was sort of an expected result. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.